Okay, so I'm really excited for this lecture. Like I was saying, it was a very difficult one to prepare for. Um, and when I started to think about what to talk about today, one of the realizations that came to mind was most triumphant civilizations in human history were built in conjunction with spiritual entities. Some were very theistic, some were what were known as multi-theistic religions where they had different gods. So the Roman civilization, for example, had gods for sun, for war, for love, for many different aspects of human endeavor. And these civilizations were built in conjunction with these entities. These entities were like oracles that were consulted before decisions were made in the physical realm. And a lot of power that sort of backed the rise and ultimately the fall of these civilizations, did not draw from just their armies. Their armies, for example, had gods that they worshipped in the secret place, as it were, that were their sources of power. So it led me to think for us, and if we keep in mind the theme of this lecture series, which is what should young people be doing differently? The reason why we're here today is because we think we probably can make a dent on our generation. We deeply believe that. So what are the secrets? What are the secrets that those who have come before us and have done a really good job at this, what do they know that we might know but are taken for granted? And of course, because of the day and age we're in, we don't discuss this enough. And so we're going to be discussing it in a very, very interdenominational way today. So first sort of argument I want to put forth here as we start this is spiritual entities make civilizations. Men build things in conjunction with spiritual entities. It might not be the exact spirit you believe in, but people build things in conjunction with spiritual entities. And whether you like it or not, your existence is worshiping a spirit. Whether you're conscious of it or not, whether you actively made that decision or not, even if you're atheist, I would say especially if you're a theist, your existence is worshiping a spirit. So at some point, you have to very intentionally make the decision for what spirit does my existence serve? What spirit does it worship? What spirit does it rely on for transactions in the earthly place? That's something that we all have to answer. Earlier on, someone mentioned Daniel, and one of the things that Daniel realized was that it wasn't the king of Babylon who was in charge of Babylon. He was very surprised to know that there was a prince called the Prince of Persia who actually governed Babylon. And he was even more surprised to find out that these princes had regimes. They had times and seasons where they operated. And when one prince was done with his regime, the next one was going to come in. And in the case of Daniel and the state of Babylon at the time, after the Prince of Persia, the Prince of Greece was going to come into power to carry out its affairs. And so the king himself occupied a throne, yes, but that throne meant nothing devoid of the spiritual entities that backed and gave legitimacy, spiritual legitimacy to that throne. And that's why for those who are believers, Paul the apostle says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. We wrestle against principalities, rulers of darkness, spiritual wickedness in high places, because these people have regimes. These spirits have regimes. These spirits, for any territory you enter, there are spirits that govern that territory. And the reason why I'm laying it up this way is for us to deeply understand the world we're in and stop being naive, about these things. And when a spiritual entity is carrying out its act of governance, it recruits agents on earth because it has no physical legitimacy in the physical realm. So what it does is it recruits men. It recruits agents that carry out the transactions that have been done in the heavenlies, in the earth realm. And those people are, they are moving amongst us like normal people. And sometimes they may not even know that they've been recruited. But like I said, your existence worships a spirit. You might not consent to it. You might not even be conscious of the fact that, you're bound to a specific spirit and doing the biddings of that spirit here on earth. But whether or not you like it, you are. And you have to make that decision for yourself. So what these entities do, these rulers of darkness, um, and agents of wickedness in high places. What they do is when they come to a very specific territory, they identify people who have destinies and ordinations of rulership over men. They sort them out by their giftings. And they do everything that they can to trap them, to trap them. So they open windows like lust, things we define as addictions. And I'm going to come to that, in a bit. And they pervert their souls. So for each of us, we are born with destinies. We are born with specific giftings that is supposed to ensure that we rule over men. But when you see people, think about it, the people who are the worst criminals. I was watching a documentary, of one of the most notorious terrorists in human history, right? And you think about it, this person is incredibly wealthy. They are worth over $300 million, but they live in a cave all their life. That level of consecration to do evil. What did we think? What do you think? Do you think they were born that way? Of course, at some point, some spirit understood that these were very gifted people who have the gifting and ordinance of rulership over men. And then they pervert that. And these people start to use it to cause all sort of chaos in the world. And that's how these things work. So when you hear of the gods of Egypt, it's not just the gods of Egypt. There were also the wise men of Egypt, right? And so that's why when, in the Egyptian civilization, in the very early days, as we saw in the Bible, when Moses went to confront Pharaoh, Pharaoh did not contend with him directly. What he immediately did was he summoned the wise men. He summoned the sorcerers because he understood that when someone comes in the name of another spirit, you need to invoke the spirits that back your throne. So we should think of it this way. Pharaoh himself, in and of himself, he's just a puppet on the throne, void of the spiritual infrastructure that backed him, that backed the Egyptian state at the time. And so, that's why ultimately when there was a submission, the wise men said, look, this, we can no longer contend with this because this is the one true God. And that's how these transactions and interactions take place. Exactly the same thing happened in Babylon when Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were brought before the king. The king examined them. He put them side by side with the sorcerers and astrologers of the Babylonian state who had access to the spiritual realities that Babylon worshipped. And on everything he demanded of them, he came to the conclusion that they were at least 10 times better than the astrologers, the wise men, and sorcerers of the state of Babylon. And of course, that opened the gates for godly influence to permeate into the kingdom of Babylon at the time. So the reason why I'm saying all this is territories are governed by spirits. Where we live, where we work, there are spirits that govern those. And we cannot be ignorant about these. And so what exactly is our duty as people of faith? Like when we say that, when we say we are people of faith, like what does that even mean? What our bill of rights? But also what are corresponding responsibilities? And that's a lot of what today's lecture is going to cover. But I want to explain just a little bit this whole idea that territories are governed by spirits. So, like I've said, when you enter any territory, there are spiritual entities who have rulership over that territory. And there are three distinct kinds of entities that take rulership over territories. The first is principalities. And the word principality is drawn from the Greek word archi. And archi means first in rank. So what this means is when a prince enters a territory, it's almost on a first come, first served basis, right? He takes ownership over that territory, and the first prince to enter any territory is the one who is called a principality. And the job of a principality is recruitment. So when a principality enters into a territory, what they do first is they sort people by their ordinations and their destinies. So, and their giftings, because they know that the giftings that people have, that you and I have, things that seem to us like our natural giftings, that is a window to rulership. If not perverted, this is a way people can gain dominion over other people. So they sort them out and identify the best people who have the gift of rulership over men. That gift is a corridor to access the soul of anyone. And so when principalities are done with recruitment, sorting, and selecting people who they want to work with, then the second type of entity, known as powers, come into play. And the word power here is the word exousia. And exousia means authority. And authority here, not in the sense of, physical authority, but it's almost like human liberty. Your authority as an individual to do whatever it is that you want to do. That's what the word exousia exactly means. It's your liberty of choice. And so when a principality assembles people and creates things that attract them, for some people it's fornication, it's lust, it's drunkenness, it's all of these very many things. A power is what binds them to those things. And these are the things we call addictions, right? And addiction is not a habit. And so if you're dealing with that, or you're trying to counsel someone who is dealing with an addiction, God help you to deal with that if you don't understand the spiritual nature of what you're dealing with, right? So an addiction is not a habit. That's why it's near impossible. And all psychologists and psychotherapists will tell you this. For almost everyone who is addicted to alcohol, for example, they have what they call a 12-step program. It almost never works. More than 85% of everyone who successfully goes through a 12-step program in psychotherapy, they revert back to it. And the reason why is you're not solving for a habit. A power has bound these men, these people, to these addictions. And provided that person continues to be an alcoholic, provided that person continues to fornicate, and these are just examples, they have no free will. And when you think about it, if you've ever encountered anyone who has any addiction of any sort, they don't really enjoy doing it. They feel terrible. They are filled with guilt and, shame and disgust and hatred for themselves after doing it. But they can't stop doing it. And you think otherwise, because if you ate a meal you did not like you wouldn't go back to eating it every time. But it's very different because these things have deep spiritual underpinnings. And we need to be very conscious of what they are. We need to be very, very, very conscious. So when a power binds a man, it binds you against your will. Because what it does is it takes advantage of the perversion and, lustful desires that you probably already have, uses that as a gateway, to access your soul, and it binds you with that. And then after that happens, the third entity or body of entities are rulers of darkness. The word rulers here is the Greek word kosmos kratos. And it refers to literally what it means is lords of the realm. Because even among spirits, they are lords, right? There's spiritual hierarchy, even in the realm of the spirit. And what lords do is they write laws. They write laws that govern territories. Why do you think about this? There are some places, there are some cities, some locales you go to, the vice of choice there is alcoholism. Almost everyone who comes from here is an alcoholic, and there are places in Nigeria like that. There are places you go to, it's armed robbery, it's violence. People who come from here are just very violent. Do you think they learn how to be violent? Is there a school where everyone who comes from a specific place goes to learn how to be violent? Because the lords, the rulers of the realm in that particular place have bound that territory. They govern that territory, and that's how they keep that territory bound. So wherever we are, there are spiritual entities that exercise dominance, that have written laws that men and women who exist in that place are supposed to be bound by. When you look at different cities in the world, and when I think about it, I'm not going to mention names. Almost every time when I see people from a very specific city, I know, oh, I knew you're from here because, wow, you're so small-minded. That's a thing. It's serious. It's a very serious thing. And when you grow up there, you're almost bound by these laws. You can never assail a certain glass ceiling, right? No matter how wealthy you become, some people it's violence. No matter how wealthy you become, you're still a thug. That's not normal. And that's nothing to be proud of. These are spiritual laws that have been written and continue to exercise governance over people. So when we're born, we've all been apportioned destinies by God who knew us before we were formed in our mother's wombs. But we come into territories that are ruled by spiritual entities who are very well aware that we're people of destiny and very special and specific ordinances. But because of our ignorance, because we don't know anything about that, then the spirit is able to access our soul. And we are bound by the averages. We are bound by laws we know nothing about. So the point here is we can't afford to be ignorant. We can't afford to be ignorant. And what's also very interesting is when this perversion happens, you don't lose your giftings, right? So if you're someone who is, maybe you were ordained to be a prophet, and of course, part and parcel of that gift of being a prophet is discernment of spirits. You can look at someone and, you can maybe discern what's wrong with them, discern what sickness is wrong with them, and pray for that to go away. Someone who has the ordinance or the ordination to be a prophet, maybe, after his soul has been perverted, will maybe go be a fraudster, right? Because he can discern your spirit. He can talk to you. He knows he can lie to you. And he can read your spirit. He knows what you're going to say next. He almost has that sense. And he knows what to tell you to get money from you. And maybe he gets $1,000 from you. And, he says life is good and he's balling. But that's not the design. That was never the design. That was never the intended design for his life. So you don't lose your giftings. You might even have a lot of material success in the world. But the problem, and we've discussed this at the previous lectures, one of these lectures is your possession and accumulation of material gifts is not a yardstick for success at all. Because sometimes false abundance is also one of the tools to pervert your soul. I'll give you everything, but your soul is mine. So these are very weighty matters. Everything I've just explained, these are very, very weighty matters that honestly, I don't think our generation is taking seriously enough. We are not paying attention, or at least we're not paying enough attention to matters that concern destiny, to matters that concern contention for the faith. And so that's the basis for today's lecture. What is our responsibility? If I say I'm a person of faith, what exactly does that mean? Like, what does that mean practically? What implication does that have for how I live my life? But more importantly, given the backdrop I've just explained and, every territory is being contested for, what is my duty in that contest? Like, am I supposed to be a part of that? Do I owe anything? Should I just figure out a way to protect me and my family and insulate us from these? These are very serious questions that we need to make decisions for, especially at this point in our lives, because if any city is going to be preserved, then we need wise men. And I hope some of us are made wise. So what qualifies us as people of faith who can be used? Fundamentally important question. The business of faith is not for immature people. And when I say the immature, I don't mean age-wise. I don't mean, you can have a 10-year-old who is a prophet and understands his calling very deeply and is acting that out in the world. So it has nothing to do with your age. But spiritual immaturity, I don't even want to use the word immaturity. I want to use the word stuntedness, spiritual stuntedness, where we don't understand and we remain dwarfs and people who nothing can ever be done through. There's nothing wrong with that, right? So, what qualifies us as people of faith who can be used? I want to further explain this. And I talked about this in the first lecture when we discussed identity. And, John gives us a blueprint for the sorts of people that can be used and, the various stratification of people who identify as believers. The first is children. Children are consumers of grace. Children live under the benevolence of God. And I would say more than 90% of people who identify as believers fall in this category, right? We look to God for the things he can do for us. Some of us, we use God for everything. We just want things to be done for us. We use God as an ATM, as a doctor, as a security man, everything. But, without identifying that beyond benefits, we actually have burdens that we need to carry. So if you're a child, that's all good and fine. God will continue to provide for you. You'll continue to receive of the benevolence of God. But the problem with children is children have no seat at the table when destiny is being contended for. even your own destiny. You barely have any seat at the table and you're enjoying God's benevolence. And that's a good place to be if you're a new believer, if that's where you started out. But God's design is not for us to remain children forever. God's design is for us to progress from that and move on to the next stage where we become sons. And the word sons here is gender neutral, of course. That refers to, people of both genders. Sons or young men are gatekeepers. They are gatekeepers of the territory. They are defenders of the territory. They are people who fight the battles of Elohim alongside him, right? And it's when we get into the realm of sonship that we can, for example, become legislators. We can become people who build a fence around the cities we're in to shut the evil one out. And that's exactly who we are. This is exactly the sort of place, that we need to get to in order for us to do anything meaningful. And these are the sort of people who John, said, you are strong and the word of God abides in you and you've defeated the evil one. That's exactly who sons are. That's not business for children. And that's very important because the testimony of a son is not, God give me a wife or give me a visa or give me a car or give me a house. At some point, those things become mundane. They are part and parcel of the package. They are part and parcel of your contention. So you don't have to worry about those things anymore. You're worried about higher things that are not just yourself, because there's not too much value to be derived if all you're doing is worrying about yourself. Because your preservation, if you're worrying about yourself, is tied to the legislation of people who have entered into the realm of sonship and are contending with destiny on your behalf and are contending with the evil one over the territory where you exist and where you belong. And the third strata, which many people aspire to get to, but of course very few, is elders, the realm of eldership, elderhood as it were. And elders are custodians of the presence of God. They are not worried about what God can do for them the way children are. They're also not worried about, at that point, they are no longer worried about what they can do for God or the battles they can fight for God, because they've done that and they've sort of earned their shit. At that point, they are concerned about the preservation of the presence of God over territories. These are people who, you don't have too many of them. You don't have too many of them. And usually, 2, 3, 4 of them is enough for an entire territory to be saved. In the day of Noah, for example, it was Noah. Right? In the time of Moses, it was because of Moses. In the time of Daniel, it was Daniel. So usually you don't need too many of those people, but they are people who gaze into eternity and their burden is preserving and guarding the jealousy of God over the territories where they are. That's who elders are, and that's where we should strive to become. So it's very important. The reason why I'm explaining this, and I pray that we get it, I genuinely pray that we get it, is we are not going to be able to do much if we don't become wise, if we don't enter into the realm of sonship. And it's hard because, we live in a time and, in a place and time too, where in some ways, there's a degree of selfishness with which we have to move around and navigate the world we live in today. You have to take care of yourself. You have to take care of the things that matter to you. But how terribly myopic would it be for us to live our lives and die that way? Yeah, that's not that's not what God has designed for us to do in any way, shape, or form. And so the call to action on this very specific point is we should set our desire on the things that are above and the things that are beyond us. And therein would we find purpose. When you're walking as a son, you don't have to ask, oh, what is the meaning of life? What is my purpose? Because it's right in front of you. You have enough knowledge. You have enough knowledge to understand what's going on. The battles that are being fought. And you understand what your place is. The specific part of the world, the specific part of the territory that God has carved out and given to you to take dominion over. For some people, it's your family. Like if you preserve this unit and the giftings and destinies that I've raised from this family by being a good parent, by being a good sibling, by being a good daughter or son, This is me fighting God's battle by carving out this small territory, this unit of the world where I actually have influence and doing a damn good job at it. For some of us, it's work. It's where you work. It's the business you start. It's the way you interact with your colleagues and your bosses or your employees, as the case may be. That's a corner of the world where you have influence. And it's demanded of you to use it and not just think about yourself and, the things that you can fill your pocket with. Because, if the territory where you're in is, doesn't belong to you, then no matter how much you have in your pocket, you're still a slave. You just maybe have a longer leash, but you're still tied to that tree anyways. And there's very little that you can do. And your resources would be used for very perverted reasons. Maybe at some point, all of it will be used to pay hospital bills, as, happens in very many societies. And, that's not what we should be striving towards as a generation. That's not what God has designed for us to be striving towards. He has designed for us to be successful. He has designed for us to live very meaningful lives, but exactly under the preconditions that he has set out for us. So let's assume you come into this realm of sonship where you have decided that as a person of faith, you want to do a little bit more than think about yourself and worry about yourself alone. What's required of you? There are about 4 things that are required of you. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the first one and then, rush through the others. The first thing that is required of you is legislation. And legislation starts with intercession. And intercession comes before evangelism. And I'm using all these very, deeply scriptural terms because I think we understand. But it doesn't even have to be, and I don't necessarily mean this in the literal sense. And when I say evangelism, I hope you don't think I refer to carrying a microphone at 5 a.m. and standing in a market, right? It is who you are and how you live your life. It's the presence that you carry around with you. There's no form of evangelism that's more efficient than that. And it comes from complete submission to the Spirit. And that's something that, we're always going to pray for God's grace to do that. It's not something that we can do from our human might and human power, but we could be doing better at it. You would very hardly find a witch that is worldly, because they understand consecrations. They understand that if they need to go live in a bush for 50 years to preserve that presence, they do that and they are very happy to. So for us, there's no price that's too heavy to pay for us to preserve the presence and move around with it. And that's exactly what I mean when I say evangelism. So not necessarily going into the markets by 5 and, and yelling at people. But before any sort of evangelism can be productive, before it can achieve any sort of results, intercession must be deeply fruitful. And there's not that many people who do this work of intercession. And I'm going to use intercession and legislation interchangeably because when you intercede, the realm of intercession is very judicial. The realm of the Spirit operates in very judicial terms. It is legislation. That's what you do. The presenting of arguments, counter arguments, that's exactly what happens. And that's what intercessors are experts at doing over a territory. So when you see a leader in a particular local or territory acting out of pockets, being deeply corrupt, or a thief who just can't stop stealing, can't stop robbing people. Like I said before, it's not always because they love doing it. It's because that lust and perversion existed in them and that has been taken advantage of to bind them. And so, before you deal with someone like that, before you deal with a case like that, let's say you come from a place where there's a very specific type of perversion. Before you deal with something like that, you don't just go out into the street to deal with that. You first have to interact in the realm of the Spirit, and you have to legislate. That's exactly what it means to be an intercessor. And I think we need more people who are intercessors, who who conduct transactions in the place of the spirit before the manifestations in the earth realm take place. And so legislation is also not a numbers game. It's a game of authority. And I mean, think about it even in earthly terms. You know, in the Senate, there's just 3 people who represent an entire state. So a state like this has 20 million people, but in the Senate, 3 people are speaking for 20 million people. It's not a numbers game. It's a game of authority. And because those 3 people have authority, they can make decisions that every one of us, all 20 million people in a specific state, are subject to and can do nothing about. So the question is, are we going to be the 20 million or strive to be the 3? Are we going to be people for whom decisions are made and maybe we're hoping someone else will take care of it, right? But in the absence of other people taking care of it, then we're subject to laws that we did not create or that we do not want to participate in. And that's how the realm of the spirit works. So we need more people. We need more people who are legislators, people who understand that there are things to contend for, and dedicate some part of their lives to that contention. Firstly, you can start with contending for your family, contending for the things and the people that are around you, and then contending for territories. It's like spiritual muscle. It's something that you build over time. And the higher you go, or the deeper you go, the more revelation you have, the more authority you carry, and the more fruitful your efforts are in the earth realm. So let's move away from being people who just enjoy God's benevolence, and decide that maybe we're people who can stand beside him in some sense. And it starts with us and how we live our life. And the choices that we decide to make. And so when Jesus comes back for the Battle of Armageddon, we hopefully can fight beside him. The second thing is citizenship. Second expectation. So this is, what is required of you. Citizenship. Citizenship is very different from membership, and you're not a member of a church or a religious body. That's not a good way to think about it. You're a citizen of God's kingdom. And there's a big difference between being a member and a citizen. You're a member at the gym, so you stroll in there and you have there's no responsibilities that accrue to you beyond just paying your gym membership and you're a member. But when you're a citizen, there are responsibilities that are required of you. The most significant responsibility that's required for you as a citizen is obedience to the laws of the lords of the land. That's the physical lords who are in positions of authority. That's the primary thing that you do as a citizen. Similarly, as a citizen of the kingdom, that's the first thing that you have to do. As a person of faith, that's the first thing that accrues to you. Obedience, complete reliance on the divine and exercising your free will and that liberty that you've so generously been bestowed with, but deciding and choosing to submit obediently to God who sent us here. So as a citizen, you're born into a specific kingdom and then you're enlisted. And not everyone who is born into a kingdom is enlisted. Because enlisting is something that sometimes is done forcefully, to be honest, but also other times it's something that you decide to do. You decide to submit yourself to, when you enlist into the army, for example, you're submitting yourself to, it's an even higher degree of citizenship. Because what you sign up to do is to defend the territory. You're not doing it because of money, because there are better things to do if you want to make money than join the army, for example. But you're doing it because hopefully you deeply believe in the ideals of the state and you think that the preservation of that state is better than, the discontinuation of it. That the preservation of the ideals that govern that state is something that should continue to propagate into generations that come after you. So that's why you take the task to defend that territory. And that's exactly what is asked of us. Citizenship requires a deep sense of alignment. It implies allegiance, obedience, identity, and submission. And if your faith, so when you're a citizen, where you belong to shapes your behavior. It shapes your identity. If you go to Saudi Arabia, for example, you can't drink alcohol. Your behavior is modified. Like, you're automatically someone who doesn't drink if you live in Saudi Arabia. There's a certain way you cannot dress if you go to some countries, for example. And so those should also be the fruits of our faith walk. If you're a person of faith, people should be able to tell the kingdom that you belong to by the fruits. And sometimes, we have funny debates about whether or not, are we concerned about the outward or the inward? And sometimes I think those debates are pushed to the extreme on both sides, right? But what faith do you have if it doesn't show in the way you show up, the way you manifest, and interact with other men in the earth realm? Then that's not a faith that has done any sort of work in you. It should be evident to you that you're a faith person, and that's exactly what we mean when we say citizenship. The third and the fourth thing, and I'm going to, just breeze through it, is your duty as a faith person is to preserve God's presence in your territory, not just his provision in your life, the preservation of his presence. And the great thing is there's no specific template for how to do this. We all have different giftings. We all have different callings and strengths. And, if we look deep enough, we know what those are. And it doesn't need to be grandiose. We can start very small to do that, to preserve the presence. When we hear things that are fundamentally opposed to the ideals and the dictates of the kingdom where we come from, of course, we should speak up about them. We should challenge them. Because when you think about it, there's almost always a contention. There's no state of being neutral. So when you hear that and your job, you think of it, my job is to preserve the presence of God here. What can I do to preserve the presence of God? Even if it's just been slightly eroded by a bit. That's completely up to us. And fourthly, finally, to carry authority. To carry authority, to be conscious of the authority that we carry, and not just people who are asking for answers. Give me, do this for me. I am waiting, do this for me. No, you have a lot of what you need to actually start. You have a lot of what you need to start. The deposits that are required for your destiny have already been made within you. They've already been put into you. And the thing is, many people live and die without figuring out what those deposits are because they never try. They are still waiting. They are still waiting. They are still waiting for more. They are still waiting for more. But how can you get more when what you have is lying latent? The Matthew principle is definitely going to apply, and what you have is going to be taken away from you. So we don't need more believers, in quotes. We need more ambassadors. When we complain about, things are not going well in the countries where we come from and the government is corrupt, but look at those governments. They are believers in government. There's a ton of them. They're believers in the civil service. So why are things not going the way God has designed for them to? Well, it's because we don't have ambassadors. We have people who are children, 60-year-old children, who have not realized that there's more. There's more to the destinies that God has given us than asking him for things and relying on him to do things for us and to kill our enemies. That's a very shallow request in the realm of the spirit. And you know what? What's funny is, the forces we contend with don't mind you remaining that way because you can keep asking for things. You can remain dependent. But they know that when it comes to spiritual legitimacy over territories, you're not someone who can contend. Because one, you don't even know that there's such a thing. And secondly, you don't have the power, you don't have the authority, because a lot of times we're shallow, myopic, and so parasitic in our relationship with the divine. And that's not what we're called to do. That's not what we're called to do as people of faith. So, what benefits accrue to us as people of faith, people who walk in this realm? And I'm going to try to close with this. There are 10 things, and I'm going to speed through them. So the first is spiritual intelligence. And spiritual intelligence is not something like, it's not as, Spiritual intelligence is part and parcel of how the world advances. For almost every new technology that we see being built by even people who are not believers. There's a deep spiritual intelligence. We cannot make progress as a civilization without spiritual intelligence. And that's one of the things that accrue to people who are men and women of faith. A lot of times, spiritual intelligence is applied perversely. Someone sent something to me. I saw a post by the BBC last week or so that described how adolescents and teenagers in Swaziland, they are doing this thing called Bluetoothing. So what that means is you use a syringe to draw blood from someone who is high on drugs and you inject it into yourself so you can be high for like 5 minutes. I saw this and I'm like, oh my God, what sort of demonic intelligence is this? And of course, it's so easy to see. This is the sort of demonic intelligence that binds territories. So it's not just going to be every young person in this territory is high on drugs every time. It's going to be sicknesses, STIs that are transmitted through all of this. And you're bound. When you think about the fact that some places just have high concentrations of specific types of diseases, what do you think? What do you really think is happening? Do you think it's just a public health issue? Anyways, so spiritual intelligence is one of the giftings that you get as a person of faith. But of course, there's a corresponding responsibility to do with that, what pleases the Father when you have that. Spiritual intelligence gives you access into even things in your life. You know when a season is done. You know when the cloud has moved. You know when to leave a job. You know when to move on to the next thing. Decision making becomes easier. You don't have to agonize over it. You no longer have to be an indecisive person because you know when you're not walking in purpose anymore. So that's one of the gifts that you get. The next is supernatural authority. Supernatural authority starts with you. Power to resist things, power to resist the flesh, power to resist, to move away from habits, to break patterns and cycles that have gone on in your family for a very long time, to decide that it ends with you. You can't decide that a pattern ends with you by force of willpower. It's impossible. If there's a pattern of drunkenness in your family, you can't decide it ends with you just by willpower. I'm going to abstain or run away from alcohol. That's not what it is. It requires a deep amount of spiritual authority for that to happen and for it to be lasting, and permanently be abolished. So, and it's also dominion over demonic influences in the realms where you are in your business. Like those are things that very freely accrue to you as a person of faith. The third thing, and I don't like to talk about this but it's economic supply. Like that is, one of the things I've learned in very recently, and one of my best friends has done a really good job of explaining this to me and, breaking it down to me in a way that I deeply believe. It's like, you don't need a job to be successful. It doesn't mean you don't need to have a job. God doesn't need a job to take care of you. He doesn't know. But of course, there's a deep purpose behind why you have a job. And economic supply is something that when we see people post about, and, usually a lot of pastors and men of God get backlash when they say, oh, God has been the one taking care of us, and people are like, ha, 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 ha. But seriously, and I don't expect we are one of those people, quite frankly. Economic supply, creative miracles, is a real thing. It's a real thing. And those are things that accrue. And the reason why that's important is when you have that, you don't have to spend your time worrying too much about certain things. You can spend that time focused on more productive things versus worrying. How would you act if you knew that everything you were worried about, and usually most things you're worried about tend to be economic in some sense. What if we knew they were taken care of? What if you knew you wouldn't sleep on the street, you would live, you would thrive, you would be happy and financially, successful enough to do what God has put you here to do? What decisions will we be making differently? How would we reallocate and reapportion our time? All of this is a call for us to do that. The fourth thing is emotional security. I don't need to explain this very much, but, we are called to cast our cares. We are taught that God is our supply and he's our refuge. And one of the most special gifts that come with being a person of faith is, supernatural calm in the face of uncertainty. And in the face of danger, being able to stay calm and make decisions and stay happy. I think if you have that, you're way more advantaged than most people. Because most people who have the things you think you have, but don't have peace, are deeply miserable. Are deeply miserable. And there's no way you can enjoy anything if you don't have peace. And I'm looking at everyone. We are hopefully mature enough to know that material things don't buy you peace, not necessarily. They buy you great things like freedom sometimes, but they don't buy you peace. And there's only one source of peace, and it draws from your faith. Your faith. And when you say faith, it is the belief in the unknown, the trust that that alignment is almost always going to happen, that your destiny was laid out before you were here and you're just walking in it. And you can't go astray. And even if you do, there will be no loss. And everything would ultimately work together for good. If we deeply believe those things that we all know, these things that we recite, our lives will be much significantly better than, they probably are right now. The fifth thing is legal rights in heavenly courtrooms. And you need legal rights in heavenly courtrooms. You need it because when you have a family member who is going through a demonic affliction, someone needs to be able to speak up. And not everybody can. It's not, oh, you go kneel down in front of someone to pray for you. And there's room for that. There's room for hands to be laid, but you need authority. When you speak, it needs to have weight. When you declare a thing, it needs to have weight. In the realm of the spirit. Like how fortunate are we to be able to move around this world with just that advantage, that unfair advantage. And these are things that a lot of times we don't cultivate enough. We're believers maybe just a little. Like we go to church, we say these things. Of course, we believe in God and, God is, God, it's God, man. But really, we need that ability to contend. And that's something that comes. That's a gift we almost freely earn as a result of being people of faith. And this is a very, very, very important one. This is a very important one. And your job as, someone who has legal rights is, you are an adjudicator in some sense. You present arguments backed by the word for why a thing should not be so. And surely enough, when you say that, you see the manifestations in the earth realm. So, the sixth thing is protection, covenant protection. This is very important, right? There are a number of ways that God intervenes in the affairs of men, and one of them is protection, and it's a very important one. Protection is this dangerous thing was supposed to happen, but miraculously, you were not at the place where it happened. And there's room for that. And we should not, sometimes we think things like this are shallow, but they are very deeply important, right? Covenant protection is no weapon formed against you shall prosper. And there's a reason why that exists. There's a reason why there's a provision for that, because that's one of the ways that God intervenes in the affairs of men, in the decisions that we make, supernatural protection, even when we're wrong. Because we're going to be wrong a lot of times. We're going to step outside of our covering a lot of times. Intentionally and unintentionally, all of us. But supernatural protection is, is just part of the package of your destiny, that there's a touch not mark on this person. And of course, you can't reap that if you're not a person of faith in truth and in spirit. The seventh thing, and this is way more practical, is identity and clarity. It's very easy because it makes it easy for you to, this is who I am and this is who I am not. You don't have to debate it. When you're in a room full of people, you know the things you can do and the things you cannot do. When it's time to make decisions, you know what's for you and what's not for you. So in many ways, being a person of faith is a productivity hack. What other people spend time debating back and forth, at least you know the things you should not do. When it's time for you to date, you know who you should not, you don't have to go back and forth on should I, you just know, because these principles are laid out and all you have to do is consult the principles that are laid out in God's word, but also the principles that govern your destiny that have been laid out and hopefully communicated to you in your secret place. And you know what you're not supposed to do. So identity, it imbues you with a sense of identity. You don't have to ask, who am I? Am I lovable? Am I likable? Is my existence worth it? Should I even be here? You don't ask all those questions. Because you know who you are exactly. You exactly know who you are. And you know what is written of you too. The eighth thing is inner freedom. As we all know, I think, even philosophers who were not of a theistic bent knew this, that true freedom also entails bondage in some sense. So what it means is that for you to be truly free, you can't do everything you want to do. True freedom means that there are things you cannot do. And within the realm, within the scope of things you can do whatever you want to do. It's a little bit paradoxical. So true freedom does not come from obeying your childish, lustful whim whenever you want to. I want to eat now. I want to go here now. I want to do this now. No, that's not true freedom. If anything, you're a slave to your appetites. True freedom comes from mastery over those appetites. And that's one of the things that we get, as part of our faith walk. We also get the truth. And it's said of the truth in the Bible that it's what sets you free. And that's what the Son of Man came to do, to make us free. So that's exactly one of the things that accrues to us. We're free. We're free from the things that shackle us. We are free from psychological conditionings that we are bound by. We are free from habits, from addictions, from, all of these things that we know, even from a very practical point of view, are detracting from the quality of life that we have. Some people just don't believe that they are lovable. And I'm saying this with a great degree of empathy. But you think that's normal? Of course, that's not ordinary. There are very many things that we've assumed as normal. Some people just, feel so small. And for someone on the outside seeing them, you're like, oh, haha, you're joking. But they are not. That's not ordinary. That's not ordinary. And we need freedom from those things. And that's exactly what I mean in this context when I say freedom. That's what I mean when I say true freedom. True freedom from those things that shackle us, accrues to us. That was number 7, 8. Number 9, governing influence in the real world, right? Because we're the city that's set on a hill, and we've been given dominion. We've been given dominion. And there's people of faith who, of course, apply principles of excellence, are diligent, have a high degree of integrity, and, leave out the virtues, the fruit of the Spirit flow freely through us. What do you think the result of that is going to be? Of course, it's going to be rulership. It's going to be dominion. And when we get to those positions, we better be prepared for it. We better be prepared for it. So that's one of the things that accrue to us, governing influence. Because we represent a kingdom. And the first thing is, it is our duty to install that kingdom in the territories where we live and then rule by virtue of our membership, of that kingdom. And the final thing, of course, very obviously, is eternal reward and purpose. That's when we get to the afterlife, that our work is not in vain, even when no one sees it. And I hope it inspires us to show up in godly excellence, even when no one is looking. Because our work is not in vain. And ultimately, our reward is not here. And that the obedience that we have becomes something like eternal currency, that we spend in the afterlife. So, to close this, and we'll take questions. Faith is one of the last of human freedoms. When you think about the most repressed societies in the world today, or at any point in human history, one thing that no one can ever take away from you is your faith. Even on your deathbed, when everything, your wealth, your status, your physical stature, your physical ability, your intellectual prowess, none of those things matter anymore. What matters to the day you leave this world is your faith and what you believe. And how liberating is it to know that no matter what anyone wants to take away from you, the government, people who hate you, your enemies, no one can take away your faith without your consent. How liberating is it to live that way? For us to live our lives that way. And sometimes the reason why we can't defend our faith is because we ourselves are not witnesses. And so maybe that's the call. There's no evidence of faith in our lives. But it doesn't have to be so. It doesn't have to be so. We have to be prepared in whatever way to pay the price. And as the psalmist put it, the man of Calvary is used to the pattern of dying and resurrection. And maybe that's what he has called us to do, to decrease that he might increase, to die that he might live, and to let aspects of us that are not in service of his kingdom to burn away. So we can install his kingdom here on earth, and we can be people who contend with him, fight his battles for him, with him, and alongside him when he comes back, and fulfill his purpose in our generation, so that when the roll is called up yonder, we'll be there. So help us God. All right, that's a good place for us to stop.